Hello, and welcome back to the bench. My guest in this episode is Dr. Alexander Salter. He is an associate professor of economics in the Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University. He's a Young Voices senior contributor, and he's the co-author of the forthcoming book, Money and the Rule of Law, Generality and Predictability in Monetary Institutions, which is way over my head. But he's also the author of a forthcoming book on the economic thought of G.K. Chesterton, who's one of my favorite writers. I first became aware of Dr. Salter through a Q&A he did with Eileen Norcross at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And when I finished reading this Q&A, I had the feeling that this guy has a firm, well-researched, and rigorously thought-out grasp on all the ideas that I've been sort of blindly feeling my way toward, and I knew I just had to talk to him. He's also written an article for the American Conservative, a publication that I've written for myself, that has the headline, Why True Conservatism Means Anarchy, which, as someone who also enjoys writing articles with edgy headlines, I very much enjoyed. Alex and I had an excellent and really high-level conversation. I basically spent the whole hour scrambling to keep up with him. And at one point, mea culpa, I ended up talking over him slightly in my eagerness to assure my viewers that I'm not opposed to women's suffrage, which I'm not. Women should be able to vote. Just to make sure that's clear, if it's not clear from the video. Anyway, topics of conversation included G.K. Chesterton, the differences between a big C constitution and a small c constitution, polycentricity, medieval history, and Eastern Orthodoxy, to which Alex is a convert. I've linked to Alex's bio, some of his writings, and some of the other stuff we mentioned in the video video description down below. I'm going to do the YouTuber thing where I point downward. And as always, I hope you enjoy listening to this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. Thank you. Thank you for being with me, Doctor.
Thank you, Grayson. It's great to be here.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate you taking the time. Yeah, so like I explained, this is a podcast about community and what role that plays in society, right? So I'm in the Koch Associate program right now, and they talk about 4 key institutions of society: government, business, education, and community. And so obviously I'm thinking about that 4th one. And one thing I talked about in my last episode with my last guest was that I feel like one of the problems we have is that these institutions are out of balance, right? That community has sort of lost its place. And then I came across a term you used in an interview I read, which was polycentricity in society. So can you explain a little more what that means?
Sure. So polycentricity refers to a specific arrangement of social institutions that are focused on governance. Scholars who pioneered polycentricity include Elinor Ostrom, her husband, the political philosopher Vincent Ostrom. Scholars who are studying local governments like Charles Thibault. Elinor Ostrom won the 2009 Nobel Prize in Economics for a work on non-state governance, which incorporates some of these notions. Basically, polycentricity means that governance institutions are fragmented, decentralized, and overlapping. So rather than having just some sort of unitary hierarchical state that commands everything from the center, we embrace decentralization. So we make sure that problems are solved by local communities. We embrace overlapping jurisdiction. So no one person has a monopoly on decision making. And we embrace fragmentation of power, ways of preventing abuse by any one part of the system that can't impugn the integrity of the entire system. So it's a way of looking at how societies are governed that occupies the space between states and markets, because polycentric governance arrangements are almost never entirely one or the other. It's not about, are we going to use markets or are we going to use government, but it's about the space in civil society between that helps link those sectors up and makes them work even better.
That's really interesting. So the idea that it's larger than just the state, that it's is what would kind of separate it from something like separation of powers or subsidiarity, right?
Sure, those are each elements, I think, of a polycentric governance system. You would want separation of powers for reasons that go into fragmentation and overlapping jurisdictions. Subsidiarity obviously gets into decentralization, but those, I think, are components of a polycentric governing order, whereas polycentricity refers to the overall pattern, right? Sort of the bird's eye view of what the institutions do, what they look like, what agents are empowered to make decisions on behalf of their respective communities, how those decisions are checked if they become predatory, It's really a component of many, many different traditions that are sort of feeding into this thing. It's a very fascinating literature, and one that I highly encourage those that are interested in ordered liberty to study, because it turns out that if we care about a society that promotes both freedom and human flourishing, that we're not going to get it through only markets, and we're not going to get it through only government. In fact, most of what we care about is going to occupy that space between the two.
Yeah, this is something I think about a lot, right? Because if you, this is sort of where I've ended up, where if you have the state sort of dominating the market, you end up with kind of a socialist system that we don't really want. And then if you have the market, let's say, dominating the state to an unhealthy extent, you end up with sort of cronyism that you probably, that actually distorts the functioning of those markets, and that leads to bad places either, or as well. So yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that space in between those, and I think that's a really good way of stating what this whole project I'm working on is about. Can you talk a little bit about historically how we ended up here? You talk a little bit about the Middle Ages and how that was a truly polycentric society.
Right. So that's building on a lot of work that I'd done with Andrew Young, who's a colleague of mine here on the Rawls College of Business. We both sort of found ourselves independently working on medieval Europe because we found the political economy of those institutions very interesting. The nation state, right, the centralized, coherent, hierarchical political entity that we call the state, really emerged in the middle of the 17th century. It had been continuing for centuries, but that's when it reached its fruition. So if you don't understand how communities can't govern themselves without the aid of a state, you can't understand 99% of human history. Because it turns out that you can't just say, oh, I'll have an irresistible, benevolent monopoly enforcer come over the hill to enforce my property rights. No, that we didn't have access to that for most of human history, right? Under the assumption that the state is in fact benevolent. We'll relax that assumption later, I'm sure. Yeah. So I and some other of my colleagues were looking at medieval Europe, because here was a situation where power, if it existed at all, was just as likely to be used in a predatory rather than productive fashion. So the institutional design had to be really intricate to check human predatory potential and channel ambition into socially beneficial ends. Now, we're not saying that medieval Europe was a paradise, far from it. Right? If you gave me a choice between living now and living then, I would not hesitate to choose living now. But given the constraints they faced, resource endowments, technology, power distribution, et cetera, the governance institutions of medieval Europe did a really good job at checking evil predatory behavior by some groups of people and resulting in de facto supermajority systems for governance, where you couldn't really have any major innovation in how these societies were governed unless you had a concurrence amongst the various estates of the realms, nobles, burghers, clergy, even the free peasantry at some times in some places. And so those high thresholds for decision making might mean that we don't necessarily make all the collective action changes that would be good, but the other side of that filter is we do a really good job of weeding out the ones that are going to be bad. So if you want to understand the root of modern liberty, you have to go back and look at ancient medieval liberties, plural, privileges that arose for specific groups and classes that eventually generalized to a specific, not specific, but a more total embracing liberty attached to the human condition per se. So there's this big discussion about whether we're free and rich today because we escaped from medieval Europe or because we continued the best traditions of medieval Europe. And I'm definitely in camp number 2.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much kind of weird popular medievalism that you run into on the internet.
Game of Thrones.
Yeah, just, oh, well, we didn't have, we didn't have sanitation. We didn't have proper surgical sanitation because the church burned all the scientists. And, when you ask for an example, it's like, well, Galileo. It's like, well, they didn't burn him. It wasn't for being a scientist. I can go on about that.
Okay, so you went one stage more into realism. I was, referencing pop culture, and you're referencing actual arguments that people make that really just don't. Once you even crack open a basic history book, look at the primary sources, the secondary sources, it's just not what's going on. I mean, there's plenty to complain about medieval Europe, but that sort of the popular images that we have of the Dark Ages, there's a reason that historians hate that term.
Yeah.
It's so loaded and it misleads more than it illuminates. And so we really lose a lot of explanatory power with our study of these societies when we come to them with those kinds of prejudices.
Yeah. Whenever someone uses the term Dark Ages, it's like, okay, I know that you're coming at this with some very serious blinders, right? But yeah, that's so interesting. I think part of that popular medievalism is the idea that everyone just lived under this oppressive absolute monarchy, when in fact, absolute monarchy is more a product of the Renaissance and even the Age of Reason afterwards, right? You know,
Absolutely.
the greatest theory of absolute monarchy is probably Bishop Bossuet, working with King Louis XIV. And, you know, as soon as it's kind of formulated, it collapses very, very quickly as a system in most places.
It wasn't incredibly robust. I mean, it did serve the ends of certain specific monarchs. Of course, we can all think of Louis XIV. Didn't work so great in England, obviously,
Yeah.
which is one of the reasons why we do have free parliamentary institutions developing in that neck of the woods.
Mhm.
Yeah, many people mistakenly think that absolute monarchy was a theory of the High Middle Ages or at some point, but really the king was a pretty weak figure in the Middle Ages. The king was a limited war leader with some specific powers in a feudal hierarchy, but more often than not, the powerful nobles of the realm could easily put a king in his place.
Mhm.
Or oftentimes a consortium of bishops who, especially on the continent, were often landowners and could field armies.
Mhm.
They could put a monarch in his place. So to the extent that there was oppression going on, and there was, let's not mistake this for a utopia again, it was just as likely to come from a local landed magnate than the king or the prince or some figure like that. When we get theories of absolutist and centralizing monarchies in the period of early modernity, right? You mentioned thinkers like Hobbes, Jean Bodin, and then eventually Filmer, who John Locke was writing against later on. It was very much a rationalistic, innovating, centralizing project. And it proved very unstable because in order to make it work, you had to have an alliance of the king and the people against the nobles. But as soon as that centralizing power was solidified, the people quickly realized, why do we need the king?
Yeah.
And sort of the age of democracy began.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I that kind of reminds me of an article I wrote for the American Conservative a while back, where again, kind of following in your footsteps with cheeky titles to gain attention. I called it "Would G.K. Chesterton Be a Bernie Bro?"
I haven't read that, but now that you give me the title, I think I need to drop everything and go find that article.
Yeah, so I was kind of talking about how that was sort of Bernie Sanders' vision of kind of an alliance of the people and the king, you know, loosely saying that being himself against the nobles or oligarchs in this case, and how that's sort of a system that G.K. Chesterton talks about in some of his writings. So I know you're someone who writes a lot about and really enjoys G.K. Chesterton. I know I certainly do. Just what we've been talking about was, so let me back up. Sorry, let me back up a little bit.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I really like what you said about the medieval thing. One thing that really struck me when I was kind of studying the period of kind of the 2 or 3 reigns immediately following the Norman conquest was the fact that all these nobles had their own castle. So even if, you know, 1 or 2 nobles didn't like something the king wanted to do, they could just kind of shut themselves in their castle and say, like, we're in revolt now. And, you know, these castles at this stage in history were basically impenetrable. So the king would show up and lay siege to it, and they would talk back and forth for a while and meet in the middle. And then, you know, the guy would open the gates and be a loyal vassal again. I just found something very intriguing about that method of governing a society. But yeah, I was thinking of sort of the centralizing project you were talking about, and there's G.K. Chesterton wrote a short book called A Short History of England, where he talks about one of his chapters is on King Henry II and Thomas Becket, and he kind of sees King Henry II almost as a sort of forerunner of this centralizing project, who, you know, Chesterton says something like he imagined the king's justice being, you know, as common as air, right? Everyone would just breathe it in and out every day and not even know they were doing it. It would just suffuse all of society, and which, you know, was very much kind of the modern vision of the state. And that he sort of came up hard against the immovable object of Becket there, who represented kind of a polycentricity. And even though he succeeded in having Becket killed, whether he meant to or not, he ended up quite chastened by that. So yeah, I'd love to kind transition and talk about Chesterton a little more, because this is someone who values smallness, who values polycentricity, and who even helps create and champion a whole economic system intended to preserve that, called distributism. So can you talk a little bit about distributism and Chesterton? I don't know. I just want to hear your thoughts on this.
Why, yes, I can. I'm writing a book on distributism right now, so this is a topic that interests me quite a lot.
And this is so fascinating to me because, like, if you talk to a lot of serious economists, they tend to kind of brush distributism aside.
To the extent they've ever heard of it at all,
Yeah.
right? 95% of economists have never heard of it. The other 5% say this is silly, right? This doesn't comport with what we know about how markets work, and they throw it aside. And when I first read Chesterton's economic writings and the writings of his friend and colleague Hilaire Belloc, I thought that too. I was one of those who was immediately dismissive. I was only just beginning to take broader questions of political economy seriously. And so I focused on the many writings in the distributist corpus that just didn't make sense in terms of how we now know markets work. And I think that my approach to these questions might make pretty much everybody angry. It'll make the economists angry because I'm trying to build a bridge and talk about some things that are interesting. But I'll also make the theologians and ethicists angry because when it comes to a basic level, there actually is a lot in distributism that is just incorrect about the operation of markets, about what businesses can and can't do in terms of raising prices, restricting quantities. You can go through the works and find various errors that are not substantiated given what we now know about the body of knowledge that we call price theory. How markets work under competitive and quasi-competitive and occasionally even monopolistic conditions. But that doesn't mean that these guys don't have an important vision to offer. There's a lot of what they say that is good. There's a lot of what they say that is thought-provoking. They offer a very particular vision of the institutional prerequisites for human flourishing that I don't think that economists who are interested in broader social philosophic questions can ignore. And one of the claims that they make that I found particularly interesting is the necessity for preserving free institutions for productive property to be widely distributed throughout society. So it must be the case that an ordinary household, an ordinary family must be either have access to productive property or own productive property as a means of sustaining their economic independence. And they draw a plausible causal link from economic independence to political liberty. So if you take that argument seriously, it means that unless you have a certain amount of widely distributed productive property in society, you're just not going to be able to preserve decentralization and the rule of law and liberty and democracy and all these things that we think are proper for the governing of human communities. So the way that economists usually think about these things is that economic liberty, such as it is downstream from political freedom, right? You get your political institutions set up right, and then you can have good economic outcomes. They actually say the causality is more nearly backwards. You need to have a certain arrangement of economic factors in order for free political institutions to be feasible and incentive compatible for those who live under them anyway. You cannot have free political institutions if the mass of society is dispossessed of productive property. They're just not going to buy into that kind of a social system. And so I found that argument new and compelling and worth taking seriously, and I'm doing some work on it now.
It's fascinating. Yeah, I remember I recently read What's Wrong with the World, and he has a whole chapter about he has a whole chapter about women's suffrage that I thought was at first I was like, oh my gosh, what? Like, you don't think women should vote? And obviously I don't agree that women shouldn't vote, but like when I dug into his reasoning, I thought it was fascinating where he said, like, well, due to the growth of industrialization, we're in a position where women, especially lower class women, have to work. So the sort of corollary of that is like, well, if women are working and participating in the market outside the home in this way, like they need to be able to vote because they're sort of in the game now. And then he said, but why should women have to work outside the home? Like, what's wrong with having the home as a sort of locus of production where value is being created, not necessarily value that contributes to the GDP or whatever, but what's wrong with having the home as a sphere where the influence of state and market is limited? And again, like I don't think it's a good idea to divide that on lines of gender, right? I'm probably more likely to end up being the one staying home with the kids than my wife is. But yeah, I was fascinated just by kind of the principle there of like, are there ways that we can find kind of non-state and non-market solutions to things that can sort of prevent those institutions from taking over and from then causing more problems that they then need to solve also, thereby increasing their power and everything.
Right. So Chesterton in that chapter of the book leads with a conclusion, right, that was, even in his own time, it was provocative. Mm-hmm. And today it would get most of us to throw the book away, myself included, right? How can suffrage restrictions of any kind along any lines are just not even something that's worth talking about in this day and age. It's just a non-starter, both in terms of political projects and in terms of the dignity of the human person.
And to clarify even more strenuously.
Right.
Yeah. When you clarify even more strenuously, I agree with you on that. Yeah.
When you dig into his reasoning, like you just said, the way he gets to the argument's conclusion is by way of thinking about the household in a way that's actually very appealing. Mm-hmm. Right. He takes the English maxim that a man's house is his castle, a man's home is in his castle, and he runs even farther with it than any of his contemporaries. Right. Mm-hmm. He's firmly committed on this idea that the sphere of the home should be something protected, should be something, frankly, sacred. And that's something that's necessary because that's what human nature demands. It's not something that we can disregard without significantly damaging the institutional prerequisites for human flourishing. So to the extent that political and economic institutions impinge on that, we need to do something about that, right? And that's one of the chapters that I focus on in the book I'm writing, where Chesterton uses this line like, once upon a time, men were left to deliberate public things, but we never imagined that the women would take us seriously and want to join along because the home is more important. And you have to wonder, like, what is Chesterton reading here? The entire corpus of Western philosophy, going back to, the pre-Socratics, mm-hmm. basically holds up public things as more important than private things, right? So mm-hmm. if you're a free landowning male, you got to deliberate in public, and if not, you were just sort of relegated to the side. So I think that mm-hmm. Chesterton, is being cheeky to the point of being confusing in an unhelpful way with that particular part of his book. Mm-hmm. So we can obviously say, like, no, this is not something this is not a road that we want to go down. Yet at the same time, the vision that he presents of the productive household as a school for human development, as a school for human flourishing, as a way of fulfilling some part of human nature that needs that sort of communal living, that's obviously something that we want to think about, because again, if he's right about that, it's about something woven into the fabric of reality that we need that kind of productive household, mm-hmm. right? And we can talk about how productive households can exist or not exist under different institutional conditions, mm-hmm. But the idea that we can do away with it entirely, if Chesterton is right, means that we're setting ourselves up for a fall big time.
Yeah, and I do think there's, I think he was very prescient in that way. You come to a place now where the home is not a locus of production in any sense anymore, really. Kind of labor-intensive household tasks have all been automated. Nothing is really produced in the home anymore, whether that's clothing, education, whatever. You don't even need to cook necessarily. You can do HelloFresh or whatever. This episode is not sponsored by HelloFresh, but
you should see if you can get it sponsored by HelloFresh.
Yeah, I'll need to start getting, maybe when I crack triple-digit viewers, I can.
There you go. How have they done in the pandemic? Pretty good, I wonder. I wager.
But yeah, and also, so it's become more of like a dormitory almost for two people who sort of have separate careers outside the home, and they just kind of come home to consume entertainment and sleep. The children are outside the home as well, whether they're in school or daycare. So yeah, I think Chesterton was very prescient there, that the home really has kind of ceased to be a locus of production that can then be sort of a man's sacred castle, and a place where sort of your liberty and your human dignity are concentrated and where they're most clearly found, right? So my big question here is what do we do, right? How do we create a society knowing what we know about economics and knowing the parts of distributism that don't work? How do we take the parts that are really important, that are, these prerequisites for human flourishing, like you said, and how do we incorporate those into society?
You've asked the one question I don't know the answer to. Right? I'm writing this whole book on this thing, and then the concluding chapter is me basically going to be, It's hard. I'm not sure we actually know how to do this, but we should think about it. In terms of proposals, there's just so many different ways to think about this: national policy, local policy. But at the same time, the danger is immediately going to what policy solutions can we get to make society more conducive to distributism, human flourishing, things like that, that we care about, that respect the dignity of the human person.
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to take seriously, especially if we value civil society, that the thing that we should be doing isn't writing down plans or writing journal articles or even writing books, mea culpa, but actually going out and doing it, right? Everyone wants a public policy plan. Nobody wants to run for parish council or join their parish council. Everybody wants an anti-poverty program. Nobody wants to actually spend their holidays in a soup kitchen, right? So the secret to civil society, I think, might just be going out and doing it. If you want a strong family, the very best thing that you can do is go out and form a strong family. If you want an active civil society, right, donate your time. Find fraternal organizations that you like and support. Get involved in their programming. Start new institutions. I think that especially people who are predisposed to book learning, like we are, who are just sort of reading about plans and ways of reforming society, we lose sight of the fact that at the end of the day, the only way to fix this thing is for people to actually go out there and do stuff. And there's probably not much in markets that we're going to be able to get this to work. And there's probably not much in politics that we're going to be able to get this to work. Not saying that there's nothing, but I think it just has to be, we have to find actual ways of engaging our local communities and actually donate some of our time when we would rather be writing, when we would rather be working, when we would rather be binging stuff on Netflix. We have to actually get out of the home and do it. And I'm particularly bad at this. And so this is a pep talk for myself.
Yeah.
This is a pep talk for everybody that we're speaking to.
Yeah, I have this. One thing that really inspired me to do this, and the reason so the name of the podcast is The Bench. And the reason for that is during quarantine, I was bored and I built a bench for my apartment courtyard so there'd be somewhere to sit because there wasn't. And as a result, became very close friends with my neighbors. And this is kind of a joke we came up with, but it's sort of like, I sort of mean it a little more than I let on when I'm talking to my neighbors, where there's one neighbor that we're all very good friends with, who's always out in the courtyard letting his dog out or smoking a cigarette, and he just seems to always be there, so we call him the mayor of the courtyard. And I just have this image, this weird image in my head of if society collapsed, we could just start our own society in this little walled off courtyard, and he could be our mayor, the way that the Carolingians started out as mayors of the palace, right?
It could be your own little monastery, right? Your own little community.
Exactly, yeah. And so that segues well into my next question, which is, where do you see kind of examples of polycentricity in society today, and where is there room for growth into kind of a greater polycentricity, right? So an example I can think of that sort of leapt out at me was, I remember a few years ago, or this was probably several years ago now, time's weird, but there was a law passed that I can't even, the details are so fuzzy on this for me, where sheltering illegal immigrants in a certain jurisdiction was going to be considered a crime. And the local Catholic bishops literally wrote a letter to the state government and said, we're not complying with this law, sorry. And I was like, wow, yes, the ghost of Thomas Becket rises,
A little civil disobedience never hurt anybody.
Exactly. So where do you see kind of positive examples of polycentricity, and where are there ways we could do better? Because there are times when I'm with the church fragmented into so many denominations and so subsumed within partisan politics in so many cases, is there really a place for the church as a counterweight in kind of a polycentric order today?
Yeah, there very much has to be. The church has got to be a part of it, I would like to think, because as a powerful, even today, international institution of venerable ancestry, and it happens to proclaim something which is, in my belief, true, I'm not Roman Catholic, but I'm Eastern Orthodox, so I have a great deal of affection for my Roman Catholic brothers and sisters. So I would say that the religious organizations, and especially in the West, the Catholic Church has to be this independent source of authority and has to embrace that role, as in the case of the bishops that you just talked about. I think that there are still the fragments of genuine federalism in the United States. And federalism is a part of, but not the entirety of, a polycentric governance arrangement. So especially with the various differences that you saw in state level responses to COVID, I think the pandemic is terrible. Wish to God it had never happened. If it has any silver linings, one of them is it showed the degree to which there could still be a lot of policy experiments at the state level, even in high stakes environments. Right. So we're not just quibbling around the edges. Vaccine production and distribution is something that's public issue number one in most jurisdictions, both locally and nationally. And yet we see significant variation in how good at it states are. Texas is good at it. Alaska is good at it. California and New York are really, really bad at it. What are the reasons for that? Right. The whole argument for federalism, one of the arguments for federalism, is that you have these sort of laboratories of democracy. So you can actually study how specific communities solve collective action problems, figure out what works, figure out what doesn't, and reason better collectively to embrace more of the solutions in the future that actually deliver their desired results. So it's part of this broader project of democracy as discussion and deliberation, rather than the states being solely being administration bureaucracies for whatever comes down from Washington. So I hope that one of the lasting legacies of our recent tragedy will be more independence at the state and local level, not simply because it's fun to give Washington the finger, although it is, not simply because of that, but also because those are the communities in which we actually live. And that's where most of the governing that we care about, frankly, should take place, right? The government of the United States has been operating outside of its operating envelope, at least since FDR and probably since Wilson. So in terms of getting that back on track, you need the state and local governments to step up and say, this is our area of competence. This is the area that we think that we can do the most good in terms of governance solutions. And the national government, if it oversteps, we frankly disagree with your jurisdiction here and you need to back off. Whether that's actually going to happen or not, I'm not all that optimistic. Could it happen? Yeah, it could happen. Right. Once upon a time, it did happen. I think that the legacies of that kind of a political order are still with us. It's gotten a bit of a shot in the arm recently, albeit for tragic reasons. So we'll have to see whether political incentives for those who are in the legislative arena in state legislatures, city halls, actually comes down on the side of asserting a degree of policy and financial independence. That's also key, given how much money state and local governments get from DC and grants and aid programs and such. It's going to be very hard for them to resist that flow of funds, but that's something that's going to happen if we're actually going to have meaningful policy independence at the local level.
Yeah, I think that, to your point, I think it wasn't until COVID that I really understood what American federalism was or really appreciated it. I kind of knew the academic distinction between a federal and a unitarian system, or unitary, not Unitarian, geez. Wouldn't want
From context, it was clear what you meant.
Wouldn't want to live under a Unitarian system.
Me neither.
I wouldn't even want to go to Unitarian service. So yeah, I kind of knew the distinction, but during COVID, I've had two separate conversations with two separate people who weren't from the United States. And they both said basically the exact same thing of like, I don't understand. Why are all the states allowed to do it differently? And I found myself like struggling to explain and just being like, wow, it never really occurred to me how just strange American federalism is from the point of view of most other countries, right? Yeah, wow, that's fascinating.
Well, once upon a time, right, Europe was the experiment in political federalism, right, going back to the High Middle Ages. And there are, of course, earlier political arrangements that you could point towards that were de facto, if not de jure, federalist. But it is a little bit sad to see retreats away from that. Everyone is all in on centralization. Everyone is all in on hierarchy. It sort of really appeals to the regimented mind and the idea that the point of politics is to solve specific problems, and unitary organizations are best at problem solving, and so we do that. For some reason, people don't seem to be very sympathetic to the claims of democracy and self-governance, which asserts that actually it matters how you solve the problems. And also, we need to bake into the system guards against things going wrong, right? When you have one center of power making policy for 330 million people, and the policy that comes out of that is bad, the consequences are going to be way worse than if the state of Texas made a bad public policy, right? In which case it's 20 or 30 million people who are inadvertently harmed, but the smaller scale also limits the damage and makes it easier to correct the error. So you need to think about all these tertiary factors and realize that they're not, even though they're tertiary in terms of how we think about the problem, they are by no means secondary in terms of the actual facts of life on the ground governance. They need to be baked into any durable constitution, capital C or small c, that's worthy of the name.
Yeah, it sort of strikes me as like a distinction between the kind of internecine medieval warfare I was talking about earlier, and something like the Vendée Revolt during the French Revolution, where, in one way you could kind of see that as, looking at it from the Vendéan perspective, kind of something that had some degree of continuity with something medieval, right? Where France was always a highly regional country, and it wasn't necessarily unheard of for one region to rise against the king in Paris and there to be fighting there. I mean, like, that was much of the 100 Years' War. And instead they come up against this sort of modern centralized state in Paris that has sort of perfected, or not perfected, but pioneered mass mobilization of the populace, and just, chews them up completely. And there's just no coming back from that, right? That was in a way kind of a shifting point, I guess. Yeah, well, thank you. This is such like a dense interview, but I love it. One thing you mentioned that I wanted to pick up on, because I've read about this in your writing, but I wanted to kind of clarify it for people watching. You said small c or big C constitution. What is that?
Yeah, so I realized after I'd said that sentence that I introduced that distinction, and probably nobody had any idea of what I meant. I'm so wrapped up in my own head. So as I use the term, right, capital C Constitution refers to something like the Constitution of the United States, an official written down de jure constitution, whereas small c Constitution refers to the de facto constitution. And by that, I mean something more nearly like the balance of political forces in society that determine its durable decision-making structures. So for most of the history of political philosophy, when people were writing about constitutions, they were writing about small c constitutions, the actual mechanisms for collective decision-making that political entities used. Formal written down de jure constitutions are actually pretty new, an ongoing experiment in human political history, and frankly, an experiment with mixed results. So if you're reading Aristotle or you're reading Burke, you're talking about small c constitutions. If you're in the American tradition, you sort of think of capital C de jure constitutions as the only valid kind of constitution, and you think of the unwritten, informal kind as sort of a historical solicism that we need to get away from. But if you look at the entirety of human societies, most societies at most times never wrote down the structure of their government in a single document and said, see this is our, this is our roadmap. This is how we're going to do things. That's just not how it worked. And so the United States is unusual. In some ways that's good, in other ways that's not so good. And we can talk about that. But nonetheless, the distinction matters, since especially if you write down a set of procedures for rulemaking, which is what a formal constitution is, you may notice that the actual arrangements of government in the United States don't really look like what's in that document, or at least if you're of a particular political predisposition, you might suspect that. I'm sure that there are some people who honestly believe that the government that we have now is a straightforward emanation from the Constitution of 1787 or whatever. I find that stretches the truth in the imagination. That's what I meant when I said earlier that the government is operating outside of its operating envelope. We're sort of doing our own thing away from the user's manual.
Yeah. So, for example, the New Deal would have been a shift in the small c Constitution, even though it didn't involve any actual amendments to the big C Constitution.
Precisely.
Got it. Precisely. Okay. Yeah. Trying to think. There's just so much here. So you mentioned your Eastern Orthodox. I was curious how that. So I'm an Anglican, but I've been reading a lot about Eastern Orthodoxy. Just kind of the basic introductory reading list. I read The Orthodox Church and the Orthodox Way by Felicitas Ware, and then I'm reading Welcome to the Orthodox Church by Frederica Matthews Green, which I think these are kind of the introductory texts, right?
If you're interested in a little bit of heavier theology, I recommend Vladimir Lossky,
Okay.
Lossky. He does some good work on Orthodox theology.
Sure.
That I found very, very moving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how did you come to Eastern Orthodoxy, and how does that kind of affect your political vision?
Ooh, big question. Okay,
Yeah.
so this is going to be a little bit of a long story that actually starts back in graduate school. Actually, it starts in college. By the end of college, although I was raised in the United Methodist Church, I had largely lost my faith. I was identifying as an agnostic. I never really called myself an atheist because I didn't think that I could say definitively that no religious traditions were true, or that there was not some such being out there that matched what human beings had said about God. But I didn't think that any specific human religious tradition had enough truth for me to sign on to it. So I retreated away from my upbringing and my Christianity. When I got into graduate school, I realized, you know what, I haven't really done my due diligence. I've really just sort of rejected the weakest arguments for Christianity. I'm sure there are stronger ones. And so I'll go out there and I'll start reading. I'll read theology, I'll read philosophy, I'll read church history, and I'll see what I can see. And as I got into this secondary project, as I read more about these things, I became convinced that the central event of Christianity is true, that Jesus Christ is who he said he was, that he was raised from the dead, vindicating his claims to divinity, and that the church was the institution that Christ and the Holy Spirit created to carry forward his mission in the world. So, wow, okay, big philosophical 180. What do I actually do about that now? Do I go back to being a Methodist? How do I deal with the problem of denominations, right? Because once you become convinced that the Christ event is actually historical, what do you do next? And so I started reading more modern church history. I started thinking maybe I'll go back to being a Methodist. Maybe I'll consider Roman Catholicism. And as I started reading about the various unfortunate schisms in communion that have beset the Christian community almost from its beginning, I became aware of Eastern Orthodoxy and their distinctive perspective on theology and the historical events that resulted in the unfortunate break in communion between the Roman Catholic West and the Eastern Orthodox East. And I eventually moved to Lubbock to take a job with Texas Tech University. I realized that there was a Greek Orthodox parish here. And so going back to something that I said in the first 10 minutes of this podcast, it was time to get outside of my own head and actually attend a divine liturgy, right? It was all fine and good to read about these things, but I have to actually see what this is. And as I went and attended religious services there, mostly divine liturgies with the occasional Vesper service, as I interacted with the parishioners there, I eventually decided that I would become a catechumen and become instructed in the faith.
That's interesting. Sorry to cut you off, but that is something I've heard about Eastern Orthodoxy, is that it's possible to kind of read yourself into Catholicism, but it's very hard to read yourself into Eastern Orthodoxy. You do sort of have to absorb it through the liturgy.
It's very much an experiential religion. There's a reason that we're famous for telling people who ask us what we're all about, we say, come and see. We take the divine liturgy is really the summit of Orthodox theology. The Orthodox Church is very, very sparing in whom it calls theologians, right? It usually reserves those for great mystical saints like St. John the Evangelist. But the ultimate act of theology of the Church is the liturgy in which the Eucharist takes place. So if you want to know what we believe and why we believe it and what we proclaim, it's all there. And the litanies and the prayers and the chanting and the various intercessions and prayers by the priests. The symbolism rather, and ritual embodied in the liturgy, it's not just because humans like playing dress up, right? We're not saying that this answers a need about us. Oftentimes we note that the word liturgy means work of the people. And it's good to note that we are cooperating with God every time a divine liturgy takes place. But if it were ultimately something that we were doing, it wouldn't be worth anything. It is God who works. It is God who gives us the vision. It is God who makes all of this central for us. And being there and participating in it, it really is, for lack of, I mean, there's no other way of describing it other than communion with the divine. I became convinced that, I became convinced that the Orthodox Church of the religious denominations that exist today possesses the fullness of truth, and that my spiritual home was there.
Okay, so let's to tie a bow on this, and kind of bring everything full circle here. I was thinking earlier, I talked about Chesterton and his chapter about Henry II and Thomas Becket, and how Becket's martyrdom kind of stopped Henry's centralizing project in its tracks. And then Chesterton comes back to that a few chapters later in his short history and says that project sort of did find its fulfillment in Henry VIII's break with Rome, where he kind of weaponizes the mobility against the church, or the nobility. Did I say mobility? Nobility. Where he kind of weaponizes the nobility or oligarchy or whatever against the church. And by dissolving the monasteries, kind of removes the church as an effective counterweight in society, while also kind of de jure declaring himself head of the church. And that's sort of one of the great blows against polycentricity and towards centralization in the modern world. And of course, it's done for supposedly noble reasons, right? They say, oh, these monasteries are hoarding wealth and kind of being ineffectual in helping the poor. So we're going to take all their wealth and give it to the poor, and instead it goes straight into the pockets of the nobles, and then you get this kind of whole movement of Commonwealth men who are sort of kind of the first to realize what's being lost here, along with this project of centralization. So I guess my last question for you would be, is there a reason that the centralized state and the Protestant Reformation are sort of taking place at the same time? And
Ooh.
Yeah.
That is a very tough act of historical detection. Yes, but I think that it's more, I don't think it has anything to do with the intentions of the actors necessarily. I think it was mostly about the shifting nature of political coalitions and what was sustainable. So if you look at the various wars of religion on the continent that frankly are not named well, since if you look at who's lining up on each side of the ball, more often than not, Catholics and Protestants fought on the same side in the wars of religion on the continent. So don't get me wrong, there was religious animus, there was atrocious Catholic on Protestant violence, atrocious Protestant on Catholic violence. But again, a large share of the time, they would ally temporarily to go fight somebody else, right? Another army that was a mix of Protestant and Catholic. And so what was actually going on here, I think, is that it was more about political elites using this as a moment to increase their own wealth and power. And if that meant that they could gang up on the Catholic Church in their particular locality, that's what they would do. Or if it meant that they would gang up on the reformers and take their stuff, that's what they would do. So I wouldn't want to associate all of Protestantism with necessarily like the centralizing, rationalistic, hierarchical project. But I think that there is a connection in the background in terms of, okay, who's going to ally with whom, who can we gang up on, and whose stuff can we take?
Yeah. See, I was thinking about the 30 Years' War, for example, where like the war in Germany largely came to an end. But I think the 30 Years' War officially ends in 1648, I think. But I think it was France and Spain actually remained at war for several more years after that, carrying that forward, both of which were Catholic powers.
It was their favorite pastime in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Yeah. So I asked you about how you came to Eastern Orthodoxy, and then I also asked how does Orthodoxy kind of inform your political vision? And I think we kind of got off topic before I could have you answer the second half. So why don't we end on that?
That's right. Yeah. So I'd been doing a lot of scholarly work on Catholic social teaching, which is part of this book on distributism, since distributism is explicitly informed by Catholic social teaching, which doesn't necessarily mean that it appeals only to Catholics. I think one of the lines that I used that I thought that was oh so clever is that distributism is explicitly Catholic, but not specifically Catholic.
Okay.
So here I am, an Eastern Orthodox, just ordinary lay Christian, playing in someone else's sandbox. Only comparatively recently have I started to go back through the works of the great Eastern saints to read about what they say about wealth, about poverty, about the proper use of the fruits of creation and these sorts of things. And one of the reasons that it's harder is that the Eastern Orthodox Church doesn't have a magisterium, right? There is no official single catechism of the Eastern Orthodox Church where I can turn to page 274 and figure out how we should think about social questions. And I'm not saying that that's a bad arrangement, right? There are good things about having a magisterium and not so good things about having a magisterium. So the writings that I've been really getting into lately are the writings and homilies of St. John Chrysostom and St. Basil the Great and St. Gregory the Theologian, what they have to say about wealth and poverty and what the Christian duty is towards wealth and even social systems, right? They're much more focused on personal conduct since the virtue of their congregants is their primary concern, right? Especially if you're reading a book of homilies, they're actually preaching, whether they were presbyters at the time or whether they were bishops, they're preaching to their flock. And so obviously they're concerned with inculcating virtue in them, right? Bringing them closer to God. But that doesn't mean that they don't write about social systems. St. John Chrysostom has this lovely passage in a work that I haven't gotten to yet. I've just read an excerpt of the passage where he talks about one of God's plans for human peace and commerce and intercourse was scattering talents across the nation so that we trade and interact and discuss. And that's one way of coming together and communing. Not obviously in the same way as when we're at services receiving the Eucharist, but it is a way of human beings to cooperate and practice love for each other nonetheless. So there's a lot in this corpus of work that is frankly hostile to markets. And then again, there's a lot in this work which is, not so hostile to markets. And so I'm not sure that reconciliation is the right way. Like there's not probably going to be one single top-down rationalistic answer for how I can square the circle here. It's just very much a part of what would I, an ordinary lay Christian who deeply believes in these things, do to respect human dignity, because that's what it all comes down to. There was an Eastern Orthodox bishop who said, our social program is the Trinity. The mutual love that the persons of the Trinity have for each other, embodied, reflected in human dignity, whatever does that, that's what we're for. Wow, and so figuring out how to get that, that's the ball game.
Yeah. I'm wondering too, like this kind of just occurred to me as you were talking, but you could also kind of look at differences in ecclesial structure as perhaps a blueprint where the Catholic Church is very much a unitary system and there is a real sort of polycentricity in Orthodoxy where all bishops are equal. And it to your point too about kind of the High Middle Ages and their polycentricity, it does often look a little bit messier, right? In that you sort of frequently have one archbishop or one metropolitan rather breaking communion with another and restoring it several years or decades later and everything. But at the same time, it strangely seems to work.
It looks messy because it is messy. But to bring it back to Chesterton, since that seems a good place to close, that's a virtue, not a vice. Life is messy. And we should embrace social realities that reflect the necessities of the human condition. It is part of human dignity that when we want to govern each other, we don't like stamp our boots on somebody's neck and says, now you will pay me taxes and I will finance the road or the army or whatever, right? We have to actually gather in the public square and debate and deliberate. And that's going to be messy. It's going to be slow. We're going to argue. We're going to get mad at each other. We're going to fight. We may even, I may go a couple months with me being mad at my neighbor because he takes a different political position than I do in the town meeting or whatever. We may go a couple of decades with the Greek Orthodox Church not in communion with the Russian Orthodox Church, as is tragically the situation now. And we should never be sanguine or say that this is low stakes, right? Deep divisions in the human community are always tragic, but we're giving away more than we're getting when we embrace like a hierarchical unitary solution to these problems. You don't do justice to human beings when you treat them as pieces on a chessboard. you have to have the discussion. You have to have the debate. There has to be some degree to which we work these out for ourselves rather than immediately making recourse to power and domination, because that's just not respecting the image of God in each of us.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Salter, for joining me. This has been a very dense but very fascinating episode. I'm sure this is one. It's also shorter than my other ones, so you can listen to it twice, which you'll have to.
Fantastic. Yeah, this has been great. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thank you so much. Absolutely, and I'll continue following your writings, and I will check out your Chesterton book when it comes out. Do you have a release date yet at all?
No release date. The manuscript is due with the publisher at the end of December of this year. I'm mostly done. I have drafts of all the chapters except the conclusion, which I'm writing now. I want to take a little time and go back and edit the chapters to incorporate some feedback that I got at an earlier manuscript conference. I would expect that I could probably deliver the finished product by the fall, with publication of the actual thing to happen 6 months to a year after that, depending on how long the presses take.
Okay, well, you'll have to let me know when it's out. That sounds
You'll be the first one.
Interesting. Thank you. All right, well, have a good day.
Thank you very much, Grayson.